I'd like to introduce Alyssa Worsham, who is a recent graduate of the Masters of Environmental Management program at Western Colorado University, and she is also an environmental planner at an engineering and consulting firm in the Pacific Northwest. And also want to introduce Dagny Signorelli. I hope I did that right, Dagny. She is a graduate student in the Masters of Science in Ecology program at Western Colorado University and is researching historical fire regimes in the Powder-Horn Wilderness. And this session is going to focus on the research and findings of Wilderness and Fire Management Workshop and talk about prescribed fire in wilderness. So thank you very much, and go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Nancy. As she described, we're Alyssa and Dagny, and we're at Western Colorado University and spent 2022 conducting research on prescribed fire use or fire management more generally in designated wilderness areas. And we'll be presenting the results of the research today. Our team was also made up of Dr. Melanie Armstrong, who was previously with Western Colorado University and is now with University of Wyoming at the Ruckelshaus Institute, and Dr. Jonathan Koop, who is the director of the MS in Ecology program at Western Colorado. And with that, I'll hand it off to Dagny to get us started on a little bit of background on how this research came about.
All right, so the next few slides are about wilderness and fire ecology in an era of change, taken from my advisor, Dr. Jonathan Koop. Cool, so a little bit of background. Right now we're looking at two main challenges. The first challenge is the collapse of historical fire regimes due to displacement of indigenous people, livestock grazing, and fire suppression. And then our second challenge is ongoing increases in fire activity due to climate change. And these challenges pose real threats to species, ecosystems, and people. Abundant research demonstrates that prescribed fire can mitigate these changes, including in wilderness. So the first challenge, the collapse of historical fire regimes. Natural historical fire regimes in many areas were substantially shaped by people. And livestock grazing and direct fire suppression have reduced and continue to reduce fire activity. And so you could see in this graph, this is a fire scar graph. All of the vertical lines are fire scars. And you can see in this ponderosa pine forest, every 5, 10, 20 years, there's a fire until 1900. And that's where this red dashed bar is. And then there's almost no fires from 1900 to 2000 in the Jemez Mountains in Colorado. And so this is pretty common in forests in the Western United States. We could see 100 years without fire, and that's not typical of ponderosa pine forests. And so the consequence of this is fuel buildup, the loss of landscape mosaics, which can depend on the vegetation type. And then our second challenge is fire under the influence of climate change. And so these are pictures of the Las Conchas fire in New Mexico in 2011, which burned a total of 140,000 acres. In the first 13 hours of this fire, it burned an acre a second. And so this fire is burning hot, it burned really big. This extreme fire behavior led to less than 25% of the landscape still being forested in the Las Conchas footprint. And so you can see the extent of the fire there in the graph on the bottom left, and the yellow is the Las Conchas fire. And then on the graph on the right, you could see all of the green is the parts that were no longer forested. Cool. So fire under the influence of climate change. Here we can see fire activity is directly linked to fuel moisture, fire season climate, and fire season length. And so from the left, that graph shows that fuel dryness is correlated to forest fire area. The red dots are from 2000 to 2015. That looks like a pretty strong correlation. And then the graph in the middle shows that Western United States forests are seeing greater areas burned as high severity. So in 1985, there was 259 square kilometers per year burned in the Western United States forests. And in 2017, that was an 8-fold increase at 2,100 square kilometers per year. And the graph on the right is showing there's the dryness isn't necessarily going to go down. Obviously, it's the International Panel on Climate Change has projected increasing temperatures, meaning we can see longer and more extreme fire seasons, and we can expect a continued and rapid escalation in wildfire activity, doubling under the 2 degrees Celsius projections, with extremes exceeding anything that we've seen so far. So then we're kind of left with the question, could different fire management have led to different outcomes? The Lost Conchas is a good example of this because there were some areas that had been treated with prescribed fire prior to the Lost Conchas fire. And Dr. Koop did a study along with others in 2016, did a study of vegetation and fuels plots in forests exposed to different combinations of prescribed and low to moderate severity wildfire. And the Las Conchas fire, that's within the Bandelier National Monument in New Mexico. Sorry, I don't know if I said that. So the results of this, basically, the Las Conchas burn severity was reduced in the prescribed fire burn units. And so you can see with this plot here, the blue bar was prescribed fire and wildfire. The green box plot is just prescribed fire. And then the yellow box plot is wildfire only. And all of the burn severity in those areas was less than no prior fire. And so their strongest reductions where prescribed fire overlapped with low severity fire. And this is important because prescribed burn units and low severity wildfire supported forest persistence, even through a mega fire. However, in wilderness, the default strategy, fire management strategy, remains fire suppression. And so what you can see here is that dry forest and fire exclusion plus inevitable fire can be converted to non-forest, like the pictures on the right of the Cheeseman Reservoir in Colorado, which is just southwest of Denver. And so to prevent this, in the middle there, which in the middle, there's prescribed fire along with other things like thinning and cultural fire. And the utilization of prescribed fire can maintain forest ecosystems and prevent conversion to non-forest. And so then we are left with the question, what is the appropriate role for prescribed fire in wilderness? And that's kind of where our research started.
Great. So like Dagny said, that's where we started, and we developed 4 research questions to really dig into that. We focused more broadly in our research on general fire management within wilderness to help support any findings about prescribed fire. So number 1, we started with how is fire currently managed? How does that vary between different agencies, organizations, geographic regions in the United States? Just a really broad picture there. The second question asks what the decision-making rationale that land managers use when making the decisions regarding fire management in wilderness areas. Number 3 explores ideal conditions as a result of fire and wilderness management decisions as stated from land managers themselves. And then number 4 focuses on the adequacy of plans, policies, and practices for wilderness fire management, as well as potential opportunities for addressing barriers in order to achieve ideal conditions. And so to answer these questions, we did a mixed methods research project consisting of both surveys and interviews. We started with a survey that we developed with the help of local BLM and U.S. Forest Service staff in Gunnison, which is where Western Colorado University is. And we distributed the survey through different wilderness and fire newsletters, including the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance and the different fire science networks around the country as well. And in our surveys, we also then queued up the question of, would you want to participate in an interview, which was the second step of our process. So for the survey, we had 131 respondents, and then a select number of those then offered to participate in interviews as well. And we additionally gathered some further interview subjects as well from people that we had already talked to. We tried to be inclusive of all agencies and organizations, including tribes, which manage both fire and wilderness throughout the country. And for the interviews, we then took this really rich qualitative data and did some, it's called interview coding with different themes. And we focused more heavily on pulling out these common themes than really doing any sort of statistical quantitative analyses. And so that's kind of the background on that. And starting with the survey, like I said, we had 131 respondents. As you can see from the pie chart on the lower left, over half of the participants were from the Forest Service. And this makes sense because in the United States, especially in the lower 48, majority of the wilderness areas are managed by the Forest Service. When you include Alaska, the Park Service it takes the wind there. But again, in the upper right corner in that graph, you'll see that almost half of the participants are from the Rocky Mountain region. And when you add in the Pacific, a majority of folks are from those two areas of the country. And again, this makes sense considering not only where a majority of the large wilderness areas are in the country, especially in the lower 48 again, but also where a majority of the large fires that we're seeing, wildfires that we're seeing in the country. And then lastly, most of our participants in the survey had more than 15 years of experience in their field in both fire and or wilderness management. So we were talking to some really experienced folks about what they've seen throughout their entire careers, oftentimes throughout multiple agencies and multiple geographies. And so that was really interesting to hear from. So talking about research question 1, again, that was the broad question: how is fire managed in wilderness? The dominant strategy, as Dagny mentioned, is full suppression. So it was almost 70% of folks said that full suppression is used often or always within wilderness areas. And then on the other end of the spectrum, both prescribed fire and fuels treatment, it's almost 70% the opposite. So we're rarely or never used within wilderness areas. And we picked these strategies, again, based on conversations with wilderness and fire managers we were talking to locally. We did hear feedback from people about different types of strategies and perhaps language that we use, like manage wildfire for resource benefit, which has which is an evolving definition. It's been called prescribed natural fire in the past, or like let burn policies. But we mostly wanted to understand what the extent of suppression versus, or like reactive versus proactive strategies were happening. And by far it was reactive strategies, so full suppression. And I'm going to jump to research question 3 here because it shows the opposite of that last slide. When talking about ideal conditions, again, from both wilderness and fire managers, it was over 60% of people said that full suppression, they would like to see full suppression used less often. And then again, on the other end of the spectrum, things like manage wildfire for resource benefit and prescribed fire, it was over 70% of participants who would like to see those two strategies used more often. Another interesting note is that because of recent wildfire policy update, so the 2009 policy update, you can use multiple strategies when managing a fire inside or outside of wilderness. So that means you can be using full suppression on one side of the fire. You can be letting it burn on another side. And so it is really dependent on a lot of different factors, which gets into how these decisions are made. So our second research question was about decision-making processes and rationale, and we used a framework here that was developed by Stephen Fillmore and Sarah McCaffrey, who've done a lot of research in management of wildland fires and decision-making factors. The question that we asked our survey participants ended up supporting their research as well. Ours was specific to wilderness areas, whereas theirs was more about general federal lands and wildfire management. Essentially, perceived risk, which includes risk to infrastructure, human life, and natural resources, was overwhelmingly ranked as the top category for why decisions are made regarding fire management in wilderness. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we heard that fire outcomes, meaning fuel reduction, air quality impacts, expected fire behavior, and potential benefits, those were ranked at 5. They were the first category at 5% of the time. So we have risk that's really setting the stage for all management decisions, which again is driving that full suppression tactic that's used most often in wilderness areas and outside of wilderness areas. And then lastly, we asked, what are the barriers to achieving ideal conditions? What could be changed in order to make ideal or let managers use the strategies that they want in order to see the impacts or the effects in wilderness areas that they want. And overwhelmingly, public perception was the top category for both managed wildfires for resource benefit and prescribed fires. This barrier was often included with things like discussion of politics and smoke and air quality. Those were all heavily correlated. And then after that, resource availability, so things like staffing and funding, those were also top categories for both questions. So again, a barrier to manage wildfire and prescribed fire. And then geography and fuel conditions also created barriers in specific wilderness areas because of things like wilderness size, geopolitical boundaries backing up to the WUI, or uncharacteristic fuel loads in certain areas, but not others. And then if we're looking just at managed wildfire for resource benefit, some barriers specific to that strategy include risk aversion by decision makers and liability threats. So like being threatened of being sued based on decision making. Drought and changing conditions due to climate change are also a big factor. And also the personnel that are used in fire management, line officers often lack on are lacking on the ground experience. And that combined with things like agency leadership is again driving very risk-based decisions. And then when we look at prescribed fire specifically, wilderness values rises to the top there. So we had a lot of mixed opinions from people on how, whether or not barriers should exist related to wilderness values for fire management or for, prescribed fire in wilderness. Some people thought that prescribed fire was trammeling and it should not be allowed. And then other people talked very specifically about the natural role of fire in certain wilderness areas. And there was this tension between the different characteristics of wilderness, so trammeling versus naturalness. Additionally, policy, so different agencies have different policies which interpret the law, and that varies, and that especially shows in prescribed fire for wilderness. So like the Forest Service versus the Fish and Wildlife Service have very different policies for prescribed fire. And then lastly, barriers including mechanized equipment not being able to use certain things which are generally or which are perceived to be used more in prescribed fires, and suppression fires versus prescribed fires. And that, that overall, interestingly, I think comparing the barriers for managed wildfire for resource benefit versus the barriers for prescribed fire, we saw that for managed wildfire, there were things that you could control I'm sorry, let me back up. For a prescribed fire, these three things are things you can think about beforehand. So wilderness values, policy, mechanized equipment, all can be more proactive decision-making, as opposed to the barriers for managed wildfire for resource benefit, like climate and personnel experience, are going to take a lot more work. And so prescribed fire is perhaps just when proactive management or decision-making is used, you can do more prescribed fire.
Cool. Yeah, so I'm going to go over our interview results. We had 22 participants. We tried to get an even mix of fire and wilderness managers in addition to decision makers and researchers, and ended up with a 45% fire specialist participation, as you can see in the graph on the left, the orange bar. And then we also had a 50% U.S. Forest Service participation, and we tried to get an understanding of what was going on with the agency demographics. And from what we found, the Forest Service has 57% of the designated wilderness by area in the contiguous United States. But these are things that we took into consideration when we chose workshop participants, and that's something that we're going to talk about in the next hour. All right, so for our interview results, we analyzed more than 22 hours of interview recordings and relied heavily on help from Melanie, who we introduced to you earlier, who has experience with qualitative and ethnographic research. This table shows a summary of our code book, which we used in the Deduce software to categorize interview data and themes. And we asked interviewees semi-structured, open-ended questions about wilderness fire management strategies and decision-making processes, and also specific examples of fire management in wilderness. We really use these interviews as a way to pick people's brains. And then there was one question that we asked all the interviewees, which was imagine the ideal scenario and tell us how to get there if we aren't already there. And then in the next 4 slides, we will go through each of the parent codes and example interview excerpts. So first research question, how is fire managed in wilderness? We had four codes for this one. We had administrative considerations, and those include lack of resources and the national preparedness levels, which push towards full suppression. We had geography, which is, for example, easier to have more or larger prescribed fire in large wilderness areas. Think like the Frank Church River of No Return wilderness, which is 2.3 million acres. The natural environment was another category. And that was, many interviewees talked about protecting natural values, including trees like sequoias, the landscape, animals, the watershed, and culturally important plants. And then the built environment, which fires pose a risk to private property, historical resources, and recreation infrastructure, all of which can have economic impacts. And so what we found that was most interesting from the interviews in this section was that although fire management in wilderness is dominated by full suppression, managers often use this unpreferred option due to lack of resources in terms of fire personnel or the risk of high severity fire due to wilderness fuel loading. Okay, for our second research question in the interviews, What are the decision-making processes and rationale? We have 5 subcodes for that one. The first was wilderness qualities. So wilderness was put together to maintain the natural environment, but the focus has been on terms like trampling and naturalness. And then collaboration. So we heard about the importance of seeking consensus with stakeholders early to establish agreed upon decision-making criteria. And then also we heard examples of co-stewardship to foster innovative management strategies, like this quote from the tribal fireman, this quote about including a tribal fire manager on the WFDS team. And then continued research question 2. We had risk and safety considerations. We found that perceived risk is huge, and many fire management decisions in wilderness hinge on who is in charge and how much risk they are willing to take on, mainly regarding a fire escaping. And then tools and systems. So the minimum requirement analysis is used to determine what the minimum requirements are for restoring wilderness character, and that can include prescribed fire. And that's something that we're also going to talk about in the workshop. And then on the Gila wilderness, having a wilderness manager implementing the strategy of minimum impact and having wilderness resource advisors out with the fire crews. So that was another thing that interviewees talked about. Agency history, culture, and policy interpretation was our last subcode for research question 2. And that included things like agency leadership and culture affecting management and can vary geographically. And we heard that the Forest Service has the strictest interpretation of the Wilderness Act when it comes to all management, including fire. So research question 3, what are the ideal conditions then? And these we grouped into 2 subcategories, the first being natural and biophysical conditions. We heard that the ideal condition in wilderness is fire being allowed to move throughout the landscape. And in order to do that, a lot of people expressed that fuels treatments were needed to get to the ideal condition of self-limiting or self-regulation of fire regimes in the wilderness. And another sentiment that we heard was landscape mosaics or pyrodiversity with burn and unburned patches can create resiliency and diversity in wilderness ecosystems. And some interviewees mentioned that this was as hands-off as possible, and others mentioned that humans placing fire on the landscape is natural. And then our second subcode for research question 3 is social conditions. So this involves having public support. Public support can be garnered through visibility of the beneficial effects of fire, we learned through interviews. One interviewee mentioned that after prescribed fire burns in the wilderness, hunters are happy about the deer and moose hunting. And we heard that the North Cascades National Park, Yosemite National Park, and the Gila Wilderness all have public-facing fire stewards that talk to the public on active burns to frame the conversation. So most commonly, we heard that the ideal condition in wilderness is eventually letting fire play its natural role. However, because of forest conditions, this isn't a feasible option in many wilderness areas right now. So many people propose that in order to get to a place where fire could occur more naturally, many wilderness areas need to be treated first with prescribed fire and/or mechanical thinning. And for our last research question, what are the barriers to achieving ideal conditions? Basically, the barriers or opportunities for change in order to address the gap between existing and ideal fire management conditions ended up being 4 different subcodes. So the first was public communication, and that the media needs to communicate to the public about the good parts of fire. And also, it would be helpful to bring the public into the decisions so they understand the process. and for agencies to be available and have honest conversations. And another sentiment about public communication was that public understanding that there is not a no smoke option and that pristine can look like a burnt landscape. There were also administrative barriers. And so staffing, like hiring winter seasonal workers to do fuels treatment in the winter, since typically the seasonal workers for fire are just hired throughout the summer months or the fire season. And then also funding allocation, which is unlimited for wildfire suppression, but can be capped for prescribed fire. The third subcode would be plans and policies. So NEPA efficiency, updating resource management plans and policies specific to prescribed fire. And then something else we heard a lot was planning and pre-work. You got to build the trust early with the public and environmental groups to face less legislation to get environmental policy through. And the last one category is implementation and practices. So wilderness technicians could work as fire stewards or monitors, more robust after action review and apply lessons to the next fire, implement fire on the wilderness edges, and then actively manage wilderness to decrease fuel loads. All right, so conclusions. From our first part of our research, the surveys and interviews, research question 1, how is fire currently managed in wilderness? Well, there's concurrent management strategies, but usually this is fire suppression. And so these are all conclusions that led us to, that kind of steered the direction of the workshop, which we're going to talk about here in another 30 minutes. And then the fire being currently managed in wilderness depends on geography, forest conditions, and values at risk. And then research question 2, so what are the decision-making processes and rationale for wilderness fire management? We found a lot of risk and safety considerations and a lack of resources. And then the interpretation and implementation differs by agency and geography. So for research question 3, what are the ideal conditions for wilderness fire management? Wilderness and fire managers agree that wilderness should have fire, and that we need to have a better understanding of fire by the public and lawmakers. And then for research question 4, what are the barriers to achieving ideal conditions? Administrative barriers and risk aversion within agencies is a really big one. And then also public perception of fire and reactive instead of proactive management.
So some areas we identified for further research based off of what we heard in surveys and interviews, and that could really affect future management, is the extent and influences of Indigenous cultural burning in wilderness. This topic came up in almost every interview that we conducted, and it didn't neatly fit into one of our research questions, but it was a really interesting topic. It ended up coming up very heavily in the workshop that we hosted. On top of that, for specific wilderness areas, what is the extent of fire regime departures? So, for example, Dagny's research is focused specifically on this in the Powderhorn Wilderness in Colorado, but being able to understand in different places in the country, in different wilderness areas, how has the historical fire regime changed to inform future management decisions. And then additionally, the potential for restoration of these fire regimes under climate change. How quickly do we need to be acting? What kind of strategy should we be using? And again, that kind of prompts the further questions about prescribed fire in wilderness, which we talked about with our workshop participants. And with that, we'll take any questions. That's the conclusion of our research. Thank you. So the question is, does prescribed fire in wilderness necessitate the use of mechanized equipment, or can it be done without chainsaws? I think the answer is yes, it can be done without chainsaws. And we did hear examples from people who had been doing prescribed fire in certain wilderness areas for the past several decades, including Yosemite and in the Boundary Waters. And often what these wilderness managers expressed was that the tactics used during fire suppression were so much more invasive than when you have the opportunity to plan out a prescribed fire specific for wilderness areas and upholding wilderness character or values. Whereas for full fire suppression, often it's such an emergency response that that's when the chainsaw or bulldozer exceptions are let through. And so again, it's just this tension between proactive versus reactive management when it comes to fire suppression versus prescribed fires.
Give a big thanks to Alyssa and Dagny.